Okay.
coming out of the sky. Anyway, I'd like to welcome everybody to the presentation by Four Harbors Audubon Society. With COVID, we're obviously finding ways to adapt, and a lot of people are doing Zoom presentations, which we're starting to do in place of being able to have in-person programs at Emma Clark Library. And we're delighted that tonight we've got a really special person and a special program for your viewing pleasure. I think one of the most kind of magical and mystical aspects about birds are their migratory flights in the fall and in the spring. And often we'll go out and look up at the night sky and just try to imagine kind of this heavenly highway that over our heads of these birds passing either north or south, depending on the season. And we know that millions of birds do that, and yet for most of us, there's no ability to really detect them. But in fact, our speaker tonight, Bill Evans, has been able throughout most of his professional career to introduce us to that world and allow us to see and hear, more particularly, the birds that do fly over our homes on the way, again, to where they're going to either spend a winter or raise their families in the spring. So introduce Bill Evans to you. Bill is director of Old Bird Incorporated, which is a New York-based not-for-profit organization that focuses on nocturnal bird migration, research, and education. He co-authored the online resource Flight Calls of Migratory Birds with Michael O'Brien, and I think it was a CD-ROM, which I bought at the Cape May Bird Observatory probably 20 years ago or so, and I have it here. Bill's expertise on nocturnal bird migration led him to active efforts to mitigate avian fatalities at communication towers and wind turbines. His current research is directed toward understanding the impacts of artificial light on night migrating birds and their concentration dynamics along shorelines and through montane terrain. Bill's research has been covered by PBS, the BBC, National Public Radio, and in Science, the New York Times, and other science news periodicals. He currently lives with his wife and two children, as I noted, in the glaciated Allegheny Plateau ecozone south of Ithaca, New York. And so it's my pleasure again to introduce to you all Bill Evans. Bill?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be in Long Island virtually. I've only actually been out toward the East End one time, and it's just unfortunate the way things are working out not to be able to come out, because one of the things I often do for my talks is after the talk we go out and listen for night migrating birds. And tonight you have a light north. You have a light north wind. I'll switch to my presentation manually here in a second. You have a light north wind, and after this talk, if you want to try to hear some calls, just stand outside somewhere in a quiet spot and listen up. There's going to be a wave of birds coming across the sound, and by the time this talk is over, they're going to be coming over Long Island, and some of them going down the island, and probably on a night like tonight, some of them even going out over the Atlantic and heading toward their winter destinations. So I'm going to switch to my show here. Tuning in to nocturnal bird migration. And this picture is the cover of a cassette tape that I made in the late 1980s that had the night flight calls of night migrating thrushes. So these had Swainson's thrush, wood thrush, gray cheek thrush, and hermit thrush. And at the time, this was new. Some people knew these calls, but it was the first tape. It was the first audio compilation that you could buy that actually had examples of these night flight calls. And they're some of the most common flight calls one can hear in night migration. Let's see here. Always good to take a step back and look at the big picture. We are in all of us, the birds, everything going on here are in a big process with involving big time, millions and millions of years and beyond. Some bird watchers I know have constructed their own tree of life, and they've highlighted birds in the center tree, and that's for some of us bird watchers, that's the way it seems. It's all we can think about. Even within birds, we find this speciation. We have the proto-birder, your generic birder, and then seems to be different interests in birds. Feeder watchers, gull watchers, hawk watchers, and there's sometimes different personality types get attracted to different aspects of bird watching. And I'm in the night migration area. And within night migration, we even have certain specialties. There's moon watching, where you, nowadays you can take binoculars or a scope and look at the full moon on a migration night and see the birds passing, which is an incredible experience, but you can't do it every night. You got to wait for a clear sky and a full moon. Acoustic monitoring, which I'll be getting into, but imagine Native Americans, the indigenous people of this continent who were here for thousands of years, living outside, living in huts, but being able to tune in and hear these night migrations, because they can be quite extraordinary, the amount of vocalizations of birds in night migration. So that was going on, and those folks are probably the real experts. And they used it for cues for hunting, for when, for example, waterfowl were migrating over in night in the spring. Must have been a happy sign for a lot of these tribes that had weathered the winter. Radar really came out of World War II, and it was a big surprise when people realized that radar, which is basically beaming out a certain frequency of electromagnetic radiation and listening for its, or receiving the reflected energy. So World War II, it was used for detecting enemy bombers, but it was a big surprise to realize that night migrating birds were also picked up, and birds during the day were also picked up. And it was basically that water molecules in the sky reflect this type of electromagnetic radiation. So we can also see thunderstorms now with radar. We can see rain events, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Thermal imaging is another tool, and it's fairly expensive, but the prices are coming down. For about, I think, $2,000, you can get a little thermal device that will hook onto your iPhone or smartphone and allow you to see heat, which is basically sort of a form of light. It's extraordinary. But you can watch the heat. You can train a thermal imaging camera and look at the sky and see the heat of migrating birds quite high in the sky and see their wing beats. So avian night migration, you know, out of those different different study methods, we've come to realize and have some theories on why birds migrate at night. And one of the ideas is that, especially for our small songbirds, all the sparrows that are migrating now, and a lot of the warblers that have already migrated, that so insectivores and seed eaters, if they migrate at night, that allows them to rest and also refuel during the day. If they migrated all day, for some of these species, like say a Canada warbler going to Peru, If they migrated all day, then they could rest at night, but they wouldn't be able to refuel. So there's certain economy about flying at night and feeding during the day. Avoidance of predators. If they migrate at night, they don't have to worry about sharp-shinned hawks or merlins getting them. That may be a factor. And the reason I say many there is that it's fairly recently been learned that in Europe, there's a species of bat that actually preys on night migrating birds in flight. And as far as I know, that dynamic does not happen here, which is might be why we have a much more pronounced nocturnal migration here, and why we have a lot of birds calling while they're migrating. Again, at night, physically easier, it's cooler. If you're exercising and you're flying a long distance, it's energetic, and it makes sense to fly when it's cooler and the air is less turbulent. And then possibly serendipity for night migrating birds, especially the long distance travelers. The use of celestial navigation. It's much easier to sort of aim for a constellation than it is to follow a complex geographic terrain, especially for the long distance migrants going to South America, Central America. This slide needs a little better resolution, but basically some of the two main study methods for night migrating birds right now, especially that are accessible for the public, are radar, which again, it's a machine that beams out electromagnetic radiation and then listens for the reflection. So it's an active method. And then acoustics is a passive method. You're just listening for the sounds that birds make while they're in night migration. And it might not seem like much, but here in Ithaca, in a typical season, I might record 30,000 night migrating birds just of night migrating bird calls, just of songbirds. So just a little review of radar. Back in the early 90s, the Weather Service began building these NEXRAD radar sites for forecasting weather and for viewing rain events. And these gradually were built all the way across the continent, and they've been improved over time. And it's quite an amazing phenomenon. This particular image comes from last night, not tonight, but this is last night. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this area in the southeastern US, all this sort of fuzzy light blue and some of these darker green areas around some of the radar stations, that is very likely bird migration. And here's a frontal system cutting across eastern North America. And this darker yellow here, and that is rain. So the radar from the electromagnetic energy from each one of these radar stations is picking up this water in the atmosphere and showing us where the rain is, but it's also picking up biological targets. And this is behind the front, and there's migration here. Now, we're not seeing much in Western North America, and I think that has to do with the time when this was taken. So this is at 01:41 Greenwich Meridian time, which is about I think 9:40. So in the West Coast, it hadn't gotten dark yet, and the night migration hadn't started. So that's why we're not seeing a lot of bird migration targets in this slide. Now here's one of the amazing things I realized in preparing for this talk is you all have a NEXRAD radar station, the New York site called KOKX, and that is located right near where you all are based, which has a lot of potential for studying bird migration in your vicinity. So here's the NEXRAD radar loop, I'm going to play the loop here, and this is from the night of October 21, 22. And there was a southerly wind that night. We might not expect migration. It was fairly warm. And this is, the hours are shown here, but you've got to subtract 4. So right now we're at about 10, 11, 12 o'clock, midnight. And this is water in the atmosphere. There's some activity up there, but not much compared to the next night I'm going to show you. And you wouldn't be expecting a lot of, this is also a clear sky night, although there's fog on the ground. It's clear in the atmosphere. Now this was, this next night, and I think I've labeled this one wrong. This is actually, this is actually the night of October 25th. So this would have been 2 nights ago. Let's see what here. Yeah, it's the night of the 25th, 24th and 25th. So this is, again, this time right up in here shows the Greenwich time, which is, we have to subtract 4 hours to get to our time. So this is about 8 o'clock, a little after 8 o'clock. All this green are very likely birds. This is reflectivity. This is signal coming back to the radar station from the beam that it's emitting. And this radar station has a, the elevation angle is 0.5 degrees. So it gets higher as it goes out. So if you get out in the far north, far sort of upper left quadrant here, this is what this is looking at is reflectivity that's several thousand feet high above the ground, multiple thousand feet high. Closer to the radar, we're not seeing much activity. So this night actually had a north wind and the temp was in the mid 50s. A perfect night for migration. There's migration going right across the sound. I couldn't access any earlier data than 8 o'clock, so we missed the takeoff. But you see right here, there's some yellow things in here, and that's very high density bird migration up here. Birds are coming across the sound, and now as we get towards 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, we're starting to see a concentration on the south shore of Long Island. And let me see if I can go back to that. Do this one more time, but notice here at the end of this loop, as we get towards 2 or 3 in the morning, which was all the available data I could access from the National Weather Service, you'll see a concentration here on the South Shore. And as toward the end of the night, birds don't want to be flying out over the ocean. They want to come back, and you see this concentration already starting to form here. That's where I'd want to be birding in the morning on October 25th. Radar is an incredible tool to assist bird watching, but you've got to get, it's more for the hardcore bird watcher. But it's very interesting to see, for example, the continental images and to see where the bird migration is occurring on the continent. I don't know if you can take a screen capture if you want to. These are some resources. And I know we're videoing this, and this information will be available later. But what we were just looking at was data that I downloaded from the bottom site here, which is the NOAA site that has a 20-year archive. So literally, you can go back and look at every night for 20 plus years of that radar station. That is close to where your bird club is centered, where the Audubon Club is centered. There's another site here where you can go back online and get, here you have to actually order it and then see it through a special viewer, which isn't that hard if you really want it. But it's all free. And this site here, you can go back, it's the radar site based in Boulder. You can go back and get 6 nights, I believe, is online. The 6 previous days are online. So you can go back and get that right now for the previous 6 days. This site up here was developed by a guy named Paul Hurtado, who is a Cornell physics major when I was associated with Cornell a while back. And it's really fun. You can click this link and see a loop, the 12-hour loop for the night, the previous night, and to see where the birds were migrating the previous night. I could give a whole other talk on radar, but we're going to get into acoustics here. This watercolor was painted by a woman in Trumansburg, New York, not far from Ithaca. And I sort of steered her into what I wanted her to paint. And this is her, she depicts her kids looking at a laptop computer that is connected to a microphone on the roof. And this microphone is receiving in real time calls of night migrating birds. And they're using software to automatically detect those bird calls, and then they're looking at the spectrograms. And this is a over dramatized, picture of nocturnal bird migration up here. And just to give you a sense what a good migration can sound like, I just wanted to play a little clip here. And this is going to be warblers and sparrows and thrushes and grosbeaks. And hopefully someone can give me a thumbs up of either Patrice or John, or whether you're hearing these calls.
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yep.
Those are rose-breasted grosbeaks. And a lot of the warbler and sparrow calls are these very short, sort of like single cricket chirp type calls. You'll hear some of those in the background. They sound like crickets, but they're just little zeeps and seeps, and most of them are about a 20th to a 10th of a second long. And those are the calls given mostly by warblers and sparrows. And the thrushes and rose-breasted grosbeak and scarlet tanager and some of the mid-sized birds give these louder sort of mid-frequency calls. So why do birds call at night? One of the ideas is that they call to maintain in-flight associations. So if you have maybe family group that's going down to Central America together, they want to stay in contact. When they're migrating at night, they can't see each other. They're doing it, as I said before, maybe because it's safer. And that has been carved out of time. The reason why they migrate at night has just been carved for, we can speculate, but we're not exactly sure of all the reasons. But they're making these flights at night. They can't really see each other. And a lot of them give calls to maintain contact with groups. And related is they do that for air traffic control. A lot of times when you hear warblers going over at night, it's not all the same species. It's mixed species flocks going over. And they're not flying in a tight formation, they're flying in a loose formation. Because if they crash and they can't see each other, if they collide it to another night migrating bird and they break a wing, that's it. So they've learned over time not to fly too close at night, or if they do fly close, they have to have confidence that they're not going to collide. And one of the ways they work out that confidence is by giving calls. I'm here, where are you? They listen, they get the feedback from others that they may be in proximity to or traveling with. And after a little while, they get comfortable and it's not a stressful thing for them. They get in some kind of Zen, you know, state, I think, and they just go. It's intuitive. They're taking in information from the stars, wind direction, humidity, all sorts of things. It's very complex and it's very evolved, and it's a beautiful phenomenon that is as grand as a redwood. It's like a behavior that's as grand as a redwood or a sequoia. It's really just a tremendous phenomenon. Then we get to this question about why some species may not call. As far as we know, vireos and flycatchers don't call it regularly in night migration. And then there's the irony of the very vociferous during the day gray catbird. It does not call, and we have no evidence that it gives a call in night migration. Now, as I mentioned, the indigenous people to this continent were certainly aware of the flights. They heard the flights, but the first recordings, had to wait until someone invented an audio recorder, which was really in the 30s. We all hear about how Arthur Allen and his group at Cornell recorded the ivory-billed woodpecker, I think in like the 1930s, and they had a truck-sized recording station that they did that with. In this case, the first people to record night flight calls of migrating birds were Dick Graeber and Bill Cochran at the University of Illinois Natural History Survey in the late 1950s. And Cochran was an electrical engineer, and Graeber and his wife, Margaret, got Bill Cochran interested in collaborating with them on this problem of how to record avian night flight calls. And they came up with this big parabolic dish. They used hay bales around the outside to block extraneous environmental sounds. And Cochran devised a reel-to-reel tape recorder that would record 10 minutes out of every hour through the night. So they'd end up with like a 2-hour tape that had a sample of night flight calling of migrating birds through the night. That's where the recording started. There's another guy named Bill Gunn who has a fantastic audio collection that's archived at Cornell. And he also made some recordings about the same time on top of a skyscraper in Toronto. And from that time on, there were very few recordings until in the 1970s, another fellow named Ron Larkin, who I think he did his PhD at Stony Brook. In the mid-1970s, he made some recordings. And then Dave Sibley, who most of us are familiar with, the famous bird illustrator. The next recordings I could find were made by him in a Cornell art squad in 1981, where he borrowed a recorder from the Lab of Ornithology's Library of Natural Sounds. And he made a couple hours of recording there. And then he come to me, who I had a vision. I was delivering pizza back in, it was just where I was at. I was at University of Minnesota studying history of science in the humanities program. I grew up in a bird watching family from Philadelphia and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And so I had birding in my blood. And I always thought it was just going to be a hobby. I was studying history of science, and I hadn't really figured out what I was going to do. But University of Minnesota was a great place back in the mid 80s. For $26, it was $26 a credit, and it was a time when you could take classes and you could work part-time and still have make enough money to pay your rent. And that's what I did. I delivered pizza at Domino's during the night. And in the month of May, I camped at a state park because I'd gotten very into bird migration. And at first I was studying the morning flight of birds after migration. looking at the migrants, what they did in the morning. And on one night I heard coming back after delivering pizzas, like literally 2 in the morning, eat on a bluff outside the St. Paul, Minnesota. I laid down in my sleeping bag. It was a late south wind, and it was late May, and there was a huge migration, and I was just in the right place in the right time. And I remember counting what I thought were, because you could follow the birds coming. You could hear a wheat call coming. The calls would get louder, and then they would pass over. And I counted what I thought was black-billed cuckoos, and I estimated 100 an hour going over, and I'd never heard anything like that again to this day. But on that night, I had a vision. I just thought, I've got to figure out, it was such an incredible flight. I just thought, wow, if I had a recording of that whole night, that might be an important conservation document. And literally the next day, I started researching ways to record the whole night. And back then, it became using a hi-fi VCR, what we used to watch movies on. You could put it in the 8-hour mode, hook a microphone up to it, and record an 8-hour audio track. And that's what I used up until about the early 2000s, when it became economically feasible to actually record sound to a computer. This picture here is in Alfred, New York, West Central New York, and these are a couple homemade mics, a couple different designs. And what I did was, back then, when I got a job at the Library of Natural Sounds at Cornell in 1988. And at that time, I started recording right around Ithaca. I had been recording in Minnesota since 1985, and weaseled my way in to get a job at the Library of Natural Sounds at Cornell. And I started recording there, and I started recording the night flight calls there, and then my curiosity gradually expanded and got out of control. Is if I know what's happening here, what's happening 20 miles to the east, what's happening 20 miles to the west. And back then I had a network of these VCR stations across the state, and I learned some extraordinary things that, for example, gray-cheek thrush calls are much more common in Western New York than Eastern New York. Upland Sandpiper and rose-breasted grosbeak, much more common in the western part of the transect. Red-breasted nuthatches. In one of the years I did this, there was a red-breasted nuthatch eruption, and they were migrating at night. One of the problems was that most of these calls, and this gets back to Graeber and Cochran's work from the late 50s, is how do you figure out the identity of these calls when they're going over at night? And it especially is a problem. Like if you hear a flock of geese going over, well, sure, you hear those during the day and you know that call at night, and you can make the deduction. But when it comes down to warblers and sparrows, you've got 100 species giving these calls that are 1/10 to a 20th of a second long. How are you going to figure out? You can't discriminate them by year. When you first start, it's like trying to identify sparrows. They all look the same. In this case, they all sound the same. And just to give you an example here, here's a American redstart night flight call. I'm playing each one of these twice. And here's a black and white warbler night flight call. And Canada warbler. And white-throated sparrow. I should have told you to turn your volume up. Anyway, they're pretty tough when you first start. Here's a spectrogram of Canada warbler. And the spectrogram basically has frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So this is 100 milliseconds. That's 1/10 of a second long. This call, which I played for you before, is probably only about 50 to 60 milliseconds long, literally 1/20 of a second long. But the reason I have been driven to figure out these calls is, and this gets back to the first night I heard one of these big events back in spring of 1985. The first night I really tuned in, I just imagined at that time, when you're hearing thousands of calls going over, cracking open a beer, sitting up on a bluff, and being able to identify all this, being able to basically see in your mind what's going on up there. And there's that, something about that. And I literally devoted the last 30 plus years, 35 years now, to doing this, because it's an addiction. You've got to hold on to everything. Once you get into this, it is so addicting to be able to tune in to warblers migrating and night migration, to be able to have a microphone on your roof and listen, and then come down in the morning and spend a little time identifying the calls, but getting Canada warblers, black and whites, all these warblers going over your house at night, and all sorts of other species. So what this sort of led to for me, besides that initial vision, I did have a conservation vision, but I also just had a drive to know these calls at night. But I also realized, and I remember this terrible feeling when I read about Audubon describing passenger pigeons in the late 1700s going over southern Ohio for 3 days straight, blackening the sky, and realizing that those times are gone. And there was a sort of a depression I hit in my evolution with this early on, that I'm never going to be able to go back and see what was here 500 years ago. And I would have loved to have seen the natural state of this continent. And it's changing so fast now. And the only kind of, respite I had from that, or, rebound from that, was just the idea that, and I remember when this happened in the early 2000s, it's just like, I'm never going to be able to go back, but things are only going to be changing more. And what I can do is leave a record, a better record now for the future. As you go back, and we have the breeding birds survey, thanks to Chan Robbins and others, that goes back to the 1960s. But before that, it's largely anecdotal. We know there were a lot of passenger pigeons, they're gone. We take for granted our warblers now, we take for granted all this, but it is changing rapidly. I've seen it changing more rapidly in my lifetime, and I'm sure others in this group that are older than me have seen it change even more. So the power of monitoring avian night flight calls is that you're getting a very large sample of birds in a single night. And you don't have to go to Canada or South America to get Canada warblers, or many of these other neotropical migrants. You can put up a microphone on your house and tune in and make a document. You can document thousands of calls in a night, and you can hand that information up or down to the future, whichever way you look at it. So one of the ways I have the data, I showed you the Canada warbler spectrograph. They're pretty easy to, if you work at it, they're pretty easy to identify by ear, although a lot of these species are not. But in a site, and one of my monitoring stations, I redid the transect. I showed you that transect I had from the early 90s. I redid that transect starting in 2012, and I had about 5 stations across New York. And the furthest east that's most pertinent to the folks on Long Island was the station in Chatham, New York, which is a little bit southeast of Albany. And this is right on the sort of the Hudson River Valley. And it's on the the east slope, and it gets a tremendous number of calls. I regularly get 30,000 warbler and sparrow calls there a year. And so one of the challenges is that there's differing environmental noise at different stations. And environmental noise can mask weak calls. So one of the ways I'm using to look, and compare stations in different places is to look at the ratio, the percentage of, say, Canada warbler calls to all warbler and sparrow calls, because warbler and sparrow calls are very similar. And you can see in this graph here, if you can, hopefully at home, if you look at mid-August here in Chatham, not too far to your north, in this, the Canada warblers peak at about 6% of the warbler and sparrow calls at that time. And this is a running 7-day average, so it's a little wider. That's not just a single day. This is sort of just mid-August. There's this time when about 6 out of every 100 warbler and sparrow calls will be a Canada warbler call. And then it drops down rapidly. By the time you get to September, you're down to less than 2 out of every 100 call. Every 100 warbler and sparrow calls are Canada warblers, and so basically this is the peak of the peak of the migration coming through. The blue line is 5 years of data averaged with the error bars shown. And the red line was 2017, which was a pretty good year for them. Now the graph below here is Jamestown, New York, and Western New York. And you can see a much different pattern. If you look at the 5 years of data from 2012 to 2016, the highest it really gets is close to 3%. So roughly 3 out of 100. In that peak, they're only getting 3 out of 100. And my feeling is that these are characteristic patterns. And what I'm trying to document across New York State are these characteristic patterns. And it's a very time-consuming process. I'm only showing you 2 of the stations here, but I've got 5 across New York. I've got a couple in Massachusetts. And in 2013, I got really crazy and I went all the way to St. Louis. And I would say I have sort of burned out on expanding at this point. And what I'm trying to do is wrap up the data I've got. Hopefully I've got some time left to write this stuff up, because I think these are sort of, these are characteristic patterns that need to be documented and that are an independent index. There's also the total, you can also look at total calling, but then you have to factor in the differences in environmental noise. So again, Canada warbler, look at where they winter, northern South America down to Peru. I don't know about this migration route through Texas. I think some of them do come across. I'm not exactly sure about that, but here's the breeding range. And so here's, if you go to, I've got a website, oldbird.org. And Old Bird was nonprofit, founded back in 2000. And it was basically, I would have loved to have, continued at Cornell, but I couldn't deal with the overhead at the time. It was 60%. In order to pay a software person $40,000 a year back then, you had to bring in $100,000. And at the stage where this science was, it wasn't going to do that. It needed papers published. And so I went out and I formed a small nonprofit, and for $10,000 of donations raised, and we were able to develop the initial automatic detectors. So the website has links for building your own microphone, for downloading a microphone kit, for building, if you want to get you can buy a fully built microphone. There's publications here, and one of the publications links to the flight call guide that John mentioned earlier, that Michael O'Brien labored 15 years on to figure out a lot of these flight calls. And that was a CD that used to be sold at Cape May back in the 2000s. And in 2017, we put the whole thing online, and we're now working on our 20-year update. And that we're hoping to put out online in 2020. But you can also download analysis software. There's other publications here. There's this big migration night link, which is one of the biggest migrations I've ever recorded. You click on that, and you've got a 6-hour ambient experience of listening to night flight calls, and one of the biggest nights I've ever recorded in Ithaca back in near Ithaca back in mid-September. Anyway, these are some resources that I encourage. I'd love to see your bird club get a station and start monitoring long-term data. So I have a little bird call quiz that I'm going to play at the end here, but I want to finish my formal presentation with this recording, and I'll tell you a little bit about it after you hear it. You may have to turn your volume up at the beginning, and I'll just give you a clue. It's a man getting out of a car and running to make an announcement.
This is the 29th of September, 1959. 29 September, 1959. 29 September, 1959. The record will start at 7:25 standard time. 7:35 p.m.
Okay, so that was, let's see, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That was Dick Graber getting ready to start a recording for the whole night back in 1959. And the incredible and poignant experience of listening to that, for me, every time I hear it, is that we can record sound now and hand it down to the future. So that was 60 years ago, a little more than 60 years ago. It sounds as crisp as it was originally made. And we can do that with night migrating birds. And we can hand those records down with the digital advances that happen now. I mean, I used to record a whole night on a VCR tape. Literally on the volume of a VCR tape now, I could record 100 years of audio data, recording every night all year long.
Wow.
And that capability exists. It just takes people to do it. And I can't do it for everyone. Other people have to do it. You have to get the microphones, find a good place to do it, and record that. And your Audubon Society will be contributing to people 100 years down the road, 500. I don't know how long it'll go. It is important. You know, we're just scratching the surface on so much of what this information means, the utility for conservation. And all right, so I'm going to leave it at that for the actual part of the slideshow. And I've been doing these talks for over 30 years, and for every group, I've played a quiz, and you're now going to be tested with about 10 bird call, avian night flight call sequences. And if you want to get a piece of paper, you could try to write down what you think they are. Whatever. You will be graded against all the other bird clubs that I've done this for in 30 years. So there's a website, and you'll be able to see where you rank. I'm just kidding. But I'm going to stop sharing the slideshow. I'm going to go to the audio section. And this is only about 3 minutes long, and then I'll be finished. Unless, and open up for questions if anyone's still on. All right. I know most people can't let me know if they're ready or not, but I'm going to start anyway. This first sequence is, I'm not telling you what it is. You're just going to try to you're going to hear this. Imagine you're out walking your dog. You've just come out of you've just gotten home after this meeting. You're walking your dog, whatever, walking outside, and you're listening up. Remember, tonight is going to be a good migration night. There's going to be stuff up there vocalizing. Anyway, you're hearing this and you're wondering what it is. Okay, I started out easy. Those are Canada geese. I'll just give that one away. But the question is, how do you know it's Canada geese? You didn't see it, you heard it. You're making the association with hearing geese during the day, but how do you know it's not some vagrant flock of some European type of goose? You know, figuring out the identity of things that we hear commonly during the day is easy, but a lot of stuff that vocalizes at night, the calls that they give are rarely heard during the day or less commonly heard during the day. It takes a long time to learn them. All right, here's the next one. And I'll just say on that one, you know, for those of you that think wood frogs might migrate at night, you're close, but not really. Anyway, I'll give people normally if I was doing this in person, I'd take feedback from the audience, but since that can't be possible, I'm just going to say what those were. That's a flock of brant flying that I recorded literally about a week ago, flying about a few miles from where I live. And there was a low flight and they came right over, and it's such a beautiful sound. Really extraordinary to hear them so close like that. All right, here's the next one. I'll play it one more time. Okay, that one, I think they're still out on Long Island. It's a rare species up here now. We do occasionally get them, but much more common downstate. And that's the barn owl. Okay, here's the next one. That's a little tougher one. I think I'm the first one to figure that one out. It's a surprisingly common night flight call, and I'll play it one more time. Oh, hold on a second. And here's one more example. Now that I think about it, that's maybe not the best recording of that, but that's a least bittern, and it's rarely, you rarely would hear that call during the day, but it's a very easy call to detect at night, and they seem to be everywhere, even though it's, I think in New York State, TEC lists it as a threatened species, but it's pretty easy to detect in night migration. So if you want it for your yard list, one way to get it is putting a microphone on your roof. All right, next one. That one, a marsh bird is a clue. That's a Sora rail.
Wow.
And they're very vociferous in spring migration, not so much in fall. Okay, here's the next one. One more time. How did that sound to you, John? Could you hear that?
Yeah, I could hear it pretty clearly. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure what it is, but I could hear it.
Okay, that's a black-billed cuckoo. And there's a wonderful paper by a guy named Thayer back in about 1908 who wrote a paper, and I don't know if I can get the title right, but I think it's the Midnight Mid-Sky Gyrations of the Black-billed Cuckoo.
Oh, wow.
And they have this habit of flying around in the summer, and they give that call. And it's a very distinctive call. That's the call that I heard, the 100 an hour going over, 100 individuals, Here's the next one.
Sounds like a shorebird.
Like a what?
Shorebird.
Yeah, that's a Upland Sandpiper. And that's another great one. As their population declines in the Northeast, it's a wonderful one to be able to detect going over your house. They have, when I first started in that transect across New York State, I showed earlier in the 90s, early 90s, every station would get them every year. I'd get maybe 6 to a dozen individuals going over. And it was pretty consistent back then. And now I'm lucky to get a single one going over. That particular one was recorded in Oneonta at an acoustic station I had there at the Oneonta Airport in late July, I think. Let's see. Let's try this one here. This one. That's one that's, I think you hear pretty commonly on the South Shore in morning flight, South Shore of Long Island in morning flight. That's a dickcissel. It's one of the more distinctive, passerine night flight calls, small passerine night flight calls. And they really very active in morning flight, till 10 or more in the morning. And finally, this last one, I have been recording Avian night flight calls for about 35 years. And this one I got in mid-September this year. It's the first time I've ever recorded it. And it was extremely exciting. Now, in this sequence, which is about 15, 20 seconds long, you're going to hear warbler and sparrow flight calls, but there's going to be one call that's loud, and that's the one I'll be talking about, and that's the one you're supposed to try to visualize what it is. Yeah, that was a veery. Wainson's thrush. And that was the call.
Sounds like a nuthatch.
It was a nuthatch. It was a white-breasted nuthatch. And this year is probably the largest eruption of white-breasted nuthatches in anyone's memory. I know Cape May at the Higbee Dike, they have shattered their record for red-breasted nuthatch migration. They're already several thousand. And white-breasted nuthatch also, their high previously, I think, was like 60 in a season. And they're going to have hundreds. I wouldn't be surprised if it even breaks, if it gets higher. There's a tremendous, this fall is since I've been, living in New York since the late 80s, central New York, this fall is shaping up to be the largest eruption year for the most species coming out of Canada heading south. We already have here in Ithaca, red crossbill, pine siskin, evening grosbeak. Chickadees, black-capped chickadees are coming through in record numbers, both nuthatches. It's going to be a really interesting winter. And I noted that, one of the great winter eruptions that's happened in the past was in, I think, winter of 76, 77. And in that year, I think Long Island had like six boreal chickadees. And that's going to be something to look for this winter. So that's the show, guys. I'm happy to talk and answer questions. I don't know if I can see chat. That's the thing. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, I see chat, and I could maybe ask you a question from one of the participants. And that was from Gil. Gil writes that, how does one differentiate birds from rain just from the radar image?
Good question. Well, the radar, if it's a thunderstorm, the density of the rain will be higher, much greater than anything that a bird would produce. But for light rain, the way it's done is you can get to, after a while, you can sort of look at it and look at the image and tell, but the rain doesn't have any what's called radial velocity away from or toward the radar station, whereas a bird does. And one of the information, one of the sets of information that's available from each radar station that you can access is radial velocity of targets. And radial velocity of birds is roughly 30, 35 miles an hour. The harder question is, how do you differentiate birds from insects? Because insects have some velocity on their own. And that's also done by differential velocities. In a second, at the end, what I'd like to do is maybe pull up the radar for tonight, because it should be big, and I'll be able to pull that up and share it live.
Bill,
But,
I'm sorry.
But I don't know if I've answered. But basically, to answer Gil's question, you do it by accessing the velocity information for the targets.
Okay. Relating to tonight, there's a question from Kathy about what's passing overhead tonight that we should listen for. Do you know what species are involved?
Well, I would think white-throated sparrow, and I played that call before, and they give that little seep call a lot during the day in the bushes, and so it's a pretty common call. It's one that's fairly easy to learn because you can hear it a lot during the day, but it's one of their common calls during the day at this time of year. white-throated sparrow. As far as most of the thrushes have passed on, except hermit thrush is migrating now. And I don't know if you'll get them out on Long Island. John, do you get numbers of hermit thrushes out there?
Not numbers. Some, yes.
Nice. Well, they have a very plaintive whistle at night. And you could go to the Old Bird website and the publications page and call up the Evans and O'Brien flight call guide and hear it and play some examples of the flight call. But I can't exactly do it, but it's a very plaintive whistle. It's sort of like almost like a bluebird flight call.
Is it
So
reminiscent of the Veery at all?
Pardon?
Does it sound a little bit like a Veery or not?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No, Veery is more of a, it's got sort of a down and then an up, and it's a little more burry.
Right.
The other thing, a lot of, we're in this with this eruption out of Canada, there are a lot of pine siskins moving, and they, especially on the coast, they seem to call sometimes at night. So you may even hear pine siskins calls moving over at night. But I think the little seeps of sparrows, Savannah sparrow is another one. It would be very regular, I would think, at this time of year out on Long Island.
We have another question, a few more questions actually, Bill. Carl Safina asks, how do you first match those sounds with the species making them so that you know what kinds of sound a particular species is making? And that reminds me of what you said, Michael O'Brien, I guess, struggled for years to try to match, right? The calls that he heard with what species was making them.
Yes, we, it took a lot longer than we thought. And to give you an example, Michael stood at the Higbee Dike at Cape May, where you get a lot of birds in sort of reverse migration, thousands of warblers coming by in a morning. And they're still in a migratory state. They haven't settled down yet after migrating the previous night. And as they're coming over this dike, you can see them and identify them and then record the call at the same time. And so the primary way is recording the flight calls during the day, or the contact calls. In the case of something like white-throated sparrow, you're not going to see them flying during the day and giving their little seep note, but you hear them in the bushes giving it as a contact call back and forth. And they use that same contact call at night. The other thing is by recording in different geographic regions. For example, in Florida, you get a lot of bobolinks migrating, but you don't get very many dickcissels. Whereas in Texas, you get a lot of dickcissels, but not bobolinks. So you expect, in the geographic region where you're at, you expect to get flight calls at night of the species that commonly migrate through there. So there's, you can do some detective work that way. And it's the same, in the same principle, different species migrate at different times of year. We know hermit thrushes are migrating now. Veeries are already largely across the border, on their way down to South America. So we know that from diurnal sightings. So if you put a microphone out now, you're expecting what's the species that are migrating now, as far as the common calls that you're going to get. And that all worked together in a big jigsaw puzzle over time. And so as we figured out some, it was like doing the edge of the jigsaw puzzle. And then as we had fewer and fewer to get, it became faster and faster toward the center. The problem is that there's many species that have very similar calls. And there's complexes of some species there's some call types have 5 or 6 species that all sound similar. And those complexes haven't been teased apart yet. They're too similar, but they probably will be over time.
Patrice, is it possible to unmute Doug? Doug Fatuma wants to ask Bill a question.
I'm unmuted.
I just unmuted him.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, hi, I'm Doug. I started birding in the mid 1950s, so I just want to start by saying, to echoing what you said early on about the decline in bird abundance, and of course we know that from a number of analyses now. I just a couple of comments and then a question. One is uh, two day on October 25th, you said it should have been good birding down along the south shore of Long Island, and I can tell you that indeed it was. Patrice and I were there seeing, many species, including hordes of pine siskins, which everyone in Long Island has been seeing day after day after day. There's a constant flow of flocks of pine siskins, absolutely unprecedented in my experience. And so, yeah, so this is definitely a big year for those northern species. Then just one comment on the possible advantages of flying at night. You said that, how do I start my video? I don't know how I start my video. Oh, there we are. You said something about the possible advantages of flying at night, one being to avoid collisions. And well, that's reasonable, but of course the day flyers also that are going in flocks, like pine siskins, are also busily calling, even though they can see one another. So I'm not sure that that would be necessarily the first answer to the question of why do they call.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a, it's, I'm not saying it's for everything. It's just one of the theories
Mm.
on why they call, and it seems to work for warblers anyway. But anyway,
So
yeah. Sorry.
okay, so here's my question. So you were giving, the estimates of, essentially counts for individual species. The Canada warbler made up to 6% of all the all the warblers going through, or all the birds going over. And what I like, how do you actually count them? In other words, you've got all these birds calling at once. Um, are you then listening to the recordings and pulling out individuals, or do you have algorithms that are analyzing the recordings of this entire flux of great numbers of birds at once, right? So how do you count?
Yeah, well, I used to listen, back before the computers, and I used to listen back to the tapes in real time, the VCR tapes, and write it all down. But I
Right.
didn't know the warblers back. I didn't know the warblers back then.
No,
so
but
what
even
happens now is, sorry. Well, hold on. The software automatically is very good at automatically picking out bird calls. There are a lot of false detections, but you can separate those easily by eye. And what those graphs was the percent of calls identified as Canada warbler to all warbler and sparrow calls.
Is it
And it's
all
just the
warbler and
calls.
sparrow?
It's not individuals. It's not individuals. It's just the ratio. It's
No,
what you would expect in calling.
Okay, I think you're not quite getting my question. No, I'm not concerned with the number of calls versus the number of individuals. What I'm saying is, at any given time, as we listen to your tapes, you can hear that there's a large number of birds calling at the same time, forming this background against which you want us to pull out, the least bittern sound or whatever you played. So so it's easy enough perhaps for you to hear one specific Canada warbler, but at the same time, you have blackpoll warblers and whatever else calling. So how many of the birds that are calling at a given moment or during a very short interval are you actually hearing? You understand what I'm saying? They're always
The software is picking up all calls of a certain loudness.
okay. So it is over.
It makes those.
It's over okay, so it's over a threshold. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, even if they're a second apart, it still picks them up and it puts them as an individual file. And then I go through and I classify each file. So but the extraordinary thing to me is how consistent it is from year to year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think the gold mine is, as far as population, index, as a population index.
Yeah. No, I think that's very cool. I bet you could do that. That's super.
Patrice, could you unmute Brendan Fogarty? Brendan has a
She's
question.
done it. She's so fast.
Wow. There you go.
Hey,
But-
Brendan.
Hello. I think there's other questions that were in line, so I can just hang out.
Okay.
Michael Schrimpf was next, but I don't know. Michael, do you mind if Brendan goes first?
Go for it, Brendan. We'll take the next
Oh,
one.
sorry, I didn't see. Okay, I'm sorry.
All right. Well, mine should be quick anyway. This has been great, and I've been definitely trying to follow along with this in my own time and do some recording. And it's a great challenge and great fun. And thank you for all of the amazing resources you put out there. It is mind-bending. It's wonderful. So it's great to be able to thank you in person, so to speak. My only question is, you did mention thermal imaging, and I know that there's been some really interesting thermal imaging work that is being done here and there by birders. Some Cape May birders have been doing some thermal imaging to detect birds migrating at night, and then shine a flashlight and then catch them with a camera, regular diurnal camera. So just wondering if you've had any experience with thermal imaging and how that's gone.
I have. Well, initially, one of the things I was interested in my research was bird collisions with communications towers. And I've had that ever since I was a kid growing up in Minnesota, when there was a 1,000-foot TV tower not far from where I lived, and people were bringing back pails of warblers, and that was an impression for a young birder in his teens. And I always felt like at some point I was going to tackle that. And there was an effort that arose when the FCC, when we went to digital television, there was a FCC passed the Telecommunications Act, I think it was 1996. And about the year after that, I was reading a Smithsonian magazine article about the guys that climb these tall towers, these tall broadcast towers. And in that article, they mentioned that 1,000 new towers, like 1,000 feet high, were going to need to be built across the US. And when I heard about that, I just thought, oh my God, all these, and if you don't know, there are some communications towers that have killed thousands of birds in a night. And there's one in Wisconsin, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, that a physician collected for 40 years and collected over 120,000 dead birds, mostly night migrating songbirds, under that tower. And I just, it was because of the permanent red flashing lights, the permanent and then the slow flashing red lights that they put on these towers for aviation obstruction hazard warning. And so myself and other people, American Bird Conservancy played, probably the instrumental role, but also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started in 1998. It took a decade to get those rules changed. And in that process, I had joined the Fish and Wildlife Service's Communications Tower Working Group. And that was about 2003. And I got a grant. And in that grant, that was the first time I was able to afford a good thermal imager from FLIR. And I had to rent one for $5,000 a month at the time. But I used that to get my first data on birds migrating at night with a thermal imaging camera, and I was absolutely astounded. If you have a clear sky night when there's a lot of birds migrating, it's just unbelievable what's going on up there. You see the traffic. Then you combine that with acoustic and radar and everything else, and every method has its strengths and Achilles heel. So you put them all together and you get this composite. But I have not, the taking the pictures of the birds in flight seemed to start out of the morning flight stuff at Higbee. And, a while ago, all of a sudden there are these pictures of these little torpedo birds. And it was when their wings were, when they were flying with their wings in, it's just sort of all of a sudden they were everywhere, and there's this whole community of people taking these pictures. I think part of it came with good cameras, you know, the advent of good cameras for doing it. But and then you know, more recently it seems to be happening at night, and I have seen on some of the Facebook groups, and I just love it. I have not done taking the pictures myself, and I didn't know they were using thermal imaging to cue in on maybe when to take the picture. But you know, I love it, and I just think that there's so much to be learned about what's going on at night, and really, you know, the spirit of the young birders that come and live at Cape May for a while, and that spirit is really the it's just such a bright spot for ornithology. And it's not academic, it's not necessarily academic, it's just people that, you know, some gene has been turned on inside them, and they just have this passion for watching birds migrate. And you know, I am right there, even though I'm doing it in my own way up here, and I'm getting to be an old timer. I'm right there with all you guys doing that. And Brendan, I recognize your name. I recognize your name. I know you've been involved with a lot of that. So, sorry, long-winded answer.
Nah, great. Thank you.
Michael or Emily, do you have a question?
Yes. Should I go ahead?
Oh,
Hear
yeah.
me? Yeah, in the beginning, Bill, you said something about they first discovered the radar with birds with enemy radar during World War II, right? Correct?
Yes.
I hope they
Yes.
didn't confuse what they heard with the birds.
I think, you know, when you read, there's a famous book called Radar Ornithology by a guy named Eastwood. I think it was published back in the 70s. And he describes, you know, the fear, you know, when they first had this radar, and then all of a sudden there's this big bird migration night, and they think that the German, what is it, the Luftwaffe or whatever, are coming across the English Channel. And so I'm not exact, you know, it's hard to know exactly what those experiences were like, but it took a little while to sort it out, what were birds and what were enemy targets, I think.
Thank you. Very
Michael?
interesting.
Probably still today.
Michael or Emily, do you have a question too?
Yeah, thanks again for the talk. We were just wondering, when you've got one of your microphones out, how much of a cone of the sky is that sampling? How wide is that at the level at which the birds are migrating?
Well, there's different designs in a microphone for night, you know, for monitoring avian night flight calls, and you know, you can specialize in certain frequency bands, and you can specialize in you can design a microphone that picks up wider cross section of sky, or use a parabolic dish and record a more narrow cross section of sky, but potentially get higher. There's no one mic that does everything. The ones that I settled on, the design that I settled on has about roughly a 60-degree cone going, you know, expanding up into the sky of enhanced sensitivity. And it's not necessarily purely uniform, but it's roughly a 60-degree cone. I had experimented with, you know, when you get to 180 degrees, you get very good frequency response with those designs, but you pick up a lot of environmental noise, which tends to screen out weaker bird calls. And the parabolic dish is good, but it might even be too narrow to get a lot of calls. So, you know, there's still a lot to be explored with the microphone design.
Thanks.
Yeah. Mike, did you follow up, or did you?
Nope.
I have a question for you, if I may, Bill. Just looking at the sites that you had throughout New York, I could just envision that all across the United States, and every, you know, 25 miles, 50 miles, and what an unbelievably powerful tool, given modern computer, you know, capabilities, to be able to record this, right, synthesize all this, could this technology really be every bit as important as breeding bird surveys or Christmas bird counts long-term to get a whole nother data set to be able to document population changes on a continental scale?
Oh yeah, you look at something, a species like Wilson's warbler, where there's a lot of population is above the road system in Canada with a breeding range. And, you know, so the breeding bird survey, it's questionable how good a job it does on something like Wilson's warbler. So, and a lot of species like white crowned sparrow, tree sparrow, a lot of these birds, you know, gray cheek thrush that are not surveyed really. We have no survey methods. So, you know, for some species, it could be the only index we have. But for other species, you know, whenever you have two independent indexes showing the same population dynamic, that's a much stronger finding than just one or the other showing it. And right now we're so reliant on the breeding bird survey. You know, we get some information from banding, but it's not very statistically robust. So one of the strengths for the acoustic monitoring is I think it's going to be very statistically robust because you're getting a very large sample size. And then plus, if you add in transects where you can interpolate density across, because, you know, one of the things I found with those transects is you get these gradients across New York State. It's not necessarily, you know, so you get these broad front gradients. So you can have these acoustic stations which take these core samples of the night flight call activity shown by the radar. And so you could potentially interpolate population across between stations that are properly spaced. So yes, I definitely think it's there. The potential is there. The automatic recognition, everyone, you know, got excited about this, you know, back, you know, 20 years ago at Cornell, but, and everyone said, we're really going to need this to be automated because it's too tedious to identify all these by hand or by manually. And that is true. But the problem is that the automatic recognition is very slow in making progress. There are some groups at NYU and Cornell, collaboration there that is promising. There's a few other groups that are working on it. But it's going to be, there's so much variation in these flight calls. The nice thing about a lot of the night migration is that it's a pretty clean environment, acoustic environment. You know, it's not like recording birds in the woods during the day where you have all these birds singing at the same time. That's a very challenging pattern recognition problem. But at night, it's easier. But the problem is a lot of these species have overlap zones, and I think it would have to proceed, John, what you're looking for on a sort of a species by species basis. You do it with 2 or 3 species first,
Okay.
and then you add more species. You know, you're not initially going to put a transect across the country and identify everything automatically. You archive that data though, and you hand that data down to the future when that technology is there.
Right. Okay, great.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit past 9, so I think we should probably begin to wrap up or wrap up. Patrice, do you have anything that you want to add, or?
No, I think that's it. Does anybody else have any questions? I think we're okay. Nobody else asking questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
Joan, okay.
It was great.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Joan. Yeah.
Yes, Bill, this was a very nice, very good presentation. Thank you, and interesting.
Yeah, I want to say the same thing. It was highly informative, Bill. Was a topic that I don't think a lot of people know a lot about. So it really was illuminating. It was great. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks. My first Zoom time doing this. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Good night.
Okay, so we're done, everybody. Okay.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.